I want to talk a little bit about code today. Okay, today is going to be short because there isn't too much that I'm not going to sit here and read codes to everybody, but there's some highlights that we need to talk about out of NFPA Chapter 31 or Chapter 12 and 13. Okay, and again, NFPA 31 talks very heavily about oil. That's the whole purpose of the NFPA code for 31 is oil. There's other NFPA codes like NFPA 70, that's the electrical code. There's a whole set of them. But again, NFPA 31 is specifically for oil. And International Mechanical Code references NFPA 31 very heavily. Okay, now why do I care so much about code? Because when you go into your state licensing exam, okay, they do not expect you to have the codes memorized, but they expect you to know where to find it. Okay, so in other words, you get a test question on the licensing exam. It says, how high must the burners be off the floor? Or what has to protect the oil tank? Or what size does the fill pipe have to be in? Okay, your answers are going to be in your code book that you're going to be allowed to have a paper copy of, okay, when you go into your exams. Don't buy the paper copies until you're sure of the code year that your exam will be in. Okay, again, let me repeat that. Don't buy paper copies of code books until you're sure of the exam year that you will be taking, because you all have an apprenticeship to do before you go take your exams. Okay, so just be careful. Don't get an old version of the code. You want to be on the correct version of the code that matches the exam, or you're going to have problems. Okay, so I want to start off. We're going to take a look over Chapter 30 or Chapter 12 a little bit. The only other thing that I want to remind everybody on this call is that on Friday we will not have an online session. You will have a final exam that opens Friday morning at 12:01 a.m. and you can do it anytime Friday up to 11:59 p.m. You will have 2 attempts at it. I asked that, as we did the last time, I asked you take the first attempt on your own, see what you can do. Then if you need to use additional resources on the second attempt, you do so. I'll keep the higher grade. Okay, so again, you'll have 2 attempts, and I'll keep the higher grade. So challenge yourself, try doing it on your own the first time, and we'll keep the higher grade. So with Chapter 12, okay, they start off in every chapter giving you a scope. Okay, the scope basically says what the chapter applies to. This is standard through every single part of the NFPA 31 book. Okay, then they go into requirements. What is an oil burning appliance? What is a used oil burning appliance? Okay, Chapter 12, okay, talks very much about used oil burning appliances. And if you look at the basic requirements, and this is where things become important, when you look at the basic requirements, they reference other chapters. Okay, so when you're taking your exam, it's going to ask you something that might be in Chapter 12, but you're going to have to know that you might have to go look at Chapters 4 through 8 and 10 through 11. In other words, basically the entire code book. Okay, used oil burning appliances. By used oil, we mean motor oil, recycled fryer oil, and stuff like that. That's what we mean by used oil. And it can only be used in commercial or industrial applications. You cannot use used oil in residential applications. Okay? Shall not be used in residential occupancy. You can't use recycled motor oil. Used oil equipment, it also references ANSI and UL standards. Okay, so you might get a test question asking you, what standard does it reference? Okay? And again, all of this all defines what is considered a used oil appliance. When there's an asterisk next to something, it is a change from the prior code year. It's something new. It's something that's been added. Okay, and this is where they'll mess you up on your state licensing exams. Okay, the changes from the prior code years are normally what they ask about when you have code-related questions, because they want to make sure you know the most current code. Okay, so again, just be very careful about that. Okay, installation instructions. When you're talking about appliances, they always have a section on install instructions. How it's installed matters. Okay, and they always start off by telling, and we talked about this once before, it starts off by telling you you have to leave the installation instructions on the site. You can't just install everything and not leave installation and operating instructions. You have to leave that on the site. Okay? You also have to make sure that any install instructions shall include a statement that the oil burning appliance is installed by a qualified person. Okay? What is the state of Connecticut? Since most people on this call are from Connecticut, what is the state of Connecticut considered to be a qualified person? Anybody?
Just someone who's licensed?
Licensed, yes. Is an apprentice considered a qualified person?
No.
No. Okay, it's a licensed technician. Qualified person. Okay? They don't want homeowners or business owners installing this equipment on their own. And they basically, by this, they've said, okay, if somebody installs it and it doesn't work properly or kills someone, we're not liable. Because it says in the manual, it's installed by a qualified person. The clearances are very important. When we talk about clearances, that means 2 combustible objects or other walls. Okay, so in other words, and they reference you back to Chapter 10, which talks all about clearances. It has to have enough room for heat not to transfer, for flame not to transfer, and you have to be able to get in to service it. There's usually different numbers, different clearance measurements from the size of the appliance to the service panels of the appliance. Okay, because you're not going to fit in a 6-inch space that might be the clearance on the side of the appliance. Okay, there's no way you're going to be able to service it. So you have service clearances, and you also have combustible material clearances. Okay, we can't install it next to combustible liquids. Okay, they have to be separated from flammable combustible liquids. And again, because we're talking about used oil, which most often is motor oil, they reference us to NFPA31, which is just another code that the National Fire Protection Association puts out. There's a whole list of them out there. Okay, but again, they reference you to another code. Okay, the burners, okay, talks about burners, part of the chapter. It tells exactly what can be used and what can't be used, talks about the fuel supply. So under burners, well, we have to have a readily accessible manual shutoff valve. Have to have an oil filter. We already know all this stuff, but this is all in the code. The oil filter and strainer should be downstream of the shutoff valve and upstream of the fuel pump. In other words, in the piping, the shutoff valve cuts the flow of oil to both the oil filter or strainer as well as the fuel pump. The oil filter and strainer need to be removable for inspection and cleaning. Have to be able to remove them. Okay? Again, seems like common sense, but if they put it in code, there's a reason why they did it. Okay? Atomizing fuel oil burners is what we basically use now. It's telling us the air supply needs to be taken from a source that's reasonably constant in pressure and volume. Okay, in other words, you have to have enough air. I've said it before, air is the most important component of burning fuel oil. Okay? An atomized fuel supply that is covered as a part of listed used oil burner and used oil fired combination burners, for example, an air compressor, shall be deemed as meeting this requirement. In other words, if you have an air compressor in the same room, if you are pulling enough outside air for that, it's considered as part of meeting the requirement of a stable air source. Okay? Then they start talking about things like shutoff valves. Okay, and again, talks about different air pressures, talks about air intake. Okay, air intake to the air source should be free of carbon monoxide contamination. Again, we don't want to be recirculating carbon monoxide. We don't want to be pulling air out of a garage bay and putting it in someplace else. Okay, talks about, again, shutoff valves. Okay, and it refers you back to the prior item on the shutoff valves. Okay, so it refers us back to different paragraphs, different page numbers. Again, refers us backwards to a specific area of the code. Chapter 12, section Article 7, section 2.2, point number 1. And if we go back one slide, we can see what it's talking about. Okay, there's your 12.7.2.11. Okay? So all of this refers back and forth. Okay, tells us very specifically where we have to vent the flue gases. Okay? And again, refers us back to another chapter which talked all about chimney. Okay, talks about vent connectors. And again, refers us to chapter 12.8.3. Okay, so all reading code is a back and forth going to what the appliance is and then back and forth to the different sections until you find what you're looking for. Okay, but the building inspectors know this stuff. Okay, and they have enough field experience that they'll go find the code if you need them to, but believe them when they say do something, do it. Okay, don't argue with a building inspector, ever. You'll lose. Okay, so vent connectors, that's the connection between the furnace and the chimney or the smoke pipe. That's a vent connector. Okay, talks about oil supply tanks. Okay, talks about above ground tanks. Talks about second containment tanks that are sometimes required. Again, lists another standard, another code, which is the ANSI UL 80. Okay, talks about other standards. If you really want to know about it, go look at the code. Okay, but again, there's enough information in here, and there's enough information from the tank manufacturers that they're responsible for meeting those codes. You're not building a tank. You're basically installing one that meets that code. Underground tanks, again, different standards. Okay, and it refers you back to Chapter 7 for supply tanks of used oil to a used oil burning appliance. Refers you back to Chapter 7 as well. Okay, piping, oil pumps, and valves are all in the 12.10.1. Okay, and again, refers you back to another chapter that talks all about piping. Chapter 8 talks all about piping. Okay. Operating requirements, a lot of this is common sense. You would never use an oil supply that's not designated for that type of oil. Okay? You're not allowed to mix oil types. Okay? In other words, use the correct burner. Sort of makes a lot of sense when you think about it, using the correct burner. Okay? Vent connectors and chimney inspections. Okay? You have to inspect it every once in a while. It says very specifically, prior to and after installing the oil burning appliance, Consideration shall be given to inspecting the vent connector and chimneys serving the appliance. Okay, and there it says that there's an Annex E. That's sort of an appendix at the end of the book. Annex E, relining masonry chimneys. In other words, the chimney has to be in good condition. So every part of this, I mean, this one chapter referenced about 6 other chapters in the code book. So reading a code book is an exercise of finding what you're looking for. Okay, it's not going to just jump back out at you and say, this is what you're looking for. You've got to find it. Okay, and again, Chapter 12 is all about used oil equipment. Okay, that doesn't mean used appliances. That means used recycled oil. Questions on Chapter 12?
No, sir.
Okay, I do want to talk about Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is relatively short. Okay, Chapter 13 talks about combination appliances. Now, you don't often see combination appliances in residential. What we're talking about combination appliances is a commercial operator has a choice to burn either oil or natural gas, or oil and propane. They make this decision based on whichever one is less expensive. Okay, so if it's less expensive that day to burn oil, they're going to burn oil. If the natural gas price drops for a period of time, and a lot of commercial buildings, they check on a day-to-day basis, if the natural gas price is cheaper than the oil, they're going to burn the natural gas. So there's basically a switch that they can do a changeover from oil to gas. A lot of times it's using the same burner. Okay, there's a gas valve and fittings on that. So Chapter 13 talks all about appliances, in other words, furnaces or boilers, that are capable of burning either fuel oil or fuel gases. Burners, furnaces, boilers, and so on and so forth. Oil and gas appliance shall only be used in 400,000 BTU or industrial application and installations. There's no house out there, other than maybe one in Washington someplace, that burns 400,000 BTUs per hour. Okay, so again, we're talking larger installations, commercial and industrial. Okay, so when Joe Smith down the road says, I want to install a furnace that I can burn either natural gas or oil, depending on which is cheaper, I'm sorry. The NFPA code doesn't allow me to do that. Can't do it. Okay? They give some very specific guidelines here. You have to follow them. Okay? So the oil and gas burner appliances, the burner shall either be part of the appliance or separately shall be listed. Okay? In other words, it has to be UL listed. Okay, or listed by some other testing facility. Most often it's UL approved. Installation and operating and servicing instructions shall be preserved by the user. Again, they have to be left on site. This should start to look repetitive. A lot of our chapters start off the same way. Now this one adds a little tidbit. Okay, it says you have to leave a description of how to change the fuel supply. Okay? Has to be there with the burner. In other words, you can't just walk away and say, have at it, guy. You have to leave the description of how to do this operation, how to safely change from oil to gas or gas to oil. Has to be there with the installation and operating instructions. Clearances, again, they refer you back to Chapter 10. This is nothing new. We refer back and forth to Chapter 10. Okay? Now, they also bring in NFPA 54, which is the natural gas code. Because again, this is a combination appliance. So not only does NFPA31 apply, NFPA54 applies because of natural gas. Okay, if there's a differences in the clearances required, okay, if there's a contradiction between the codes, the larger clearance shall apply. In other words, if one code says you have to have a 12-inch clearance and another code says you have to have a 36-inch clearance, the 36-inch clearance applies. You don't get to choose and choose the one that's less expensive to do. Okay, the greater clearance should apply. Okay, when it talks about burner construction, again, this is very dependent on this chapter, talks about burner construction. Okay, the burner of an oil and gas burning appliance shall be arranged so that the main burner fuel not being fired should shut off automatically when the main burner is not in its intended fire positions for the fuel. All this is saying is, for example, oil requires more air. Okay, if I'm burning natural gas, until that burner is readjusted for oil, I can't restart the oil. If the burner is set up for oil, the natural gas is locked out. Okay. The other thing it's telling me in point 2 of this is that when the fuel is that's currently being fired, so in other words, if I'm currently burning oil, the oil has to be completely shut off before I deliver natural gas into the ignition zone. This is all about preventing explosions. You cannot burn two fuels at the same time. You have to shut down, change over, reignite. It's all about safety. Prior to ignition, again, the main burner fuel from either a cold start or fuel changeover. The burner ignition system shall provide a predetermined ignition cycle for the fuel being fired. All this means is that there has to be two controls, one for oil, one for gas. Okay, and the ignition sequences have to be provided by the appropriate control. Okay, then they've extended this and they say we have to have a pre-purge. All a pre-purge does is we make sure that all of the unburned fuel, all of the unburned vapors are pushed out of the combustion chamber. That's pre-purge. We're just moving the unburned material out of the combustion chamber. Pre-purge. Okay? The burner of an oil, and again, it's going to pull in standards for different, it's going to pull in UL standards. Okay, it's going to talk about pilot flames for gas. We don't have pilot flames for oil. Okay, now, it's going to talk about that it's arranged so the maximum BTU hour capacity does not exceed the maximum rated capacity of the appliance. Again, we do not exceed rated capacities, regardless of the fuel being fired. So if my furnace or boiler is a 400,000 BTU boiler, I cannot exceed 400,000 BTUs. It's whatever the factory maximum is. Okay? Changeover. Changeover just means changing between the fuels. Okay? No manual adjustment required. It has to be a changeover switch. You cannot have any manual adjustments of changeovers being required. It has to be interlocked to provide safety shutdown if a misadjustment occurs. In other words, if something doesn't change over properly, we have to have a safety adjustment. Okay? Now, fuel handling. In other words, how am I handling the gas supply? How am I handling the oil supply? Where am I storing the oil or propane? All of this goes under whatever standards are for that handling. Okay, NFPA 54, NFPA 31, International Mechanical Code, International Fuel Gas Code. All of these things apply. And all this chapter is saying is you have to meet all requirements for the standards. Okay, fuel oil components, okay, they're basically saying it has to be for the intended application. In other words, don't put a residential oil burner part on a high-efficiency oil-gas burner combination. Okay, the pressures won't work. Don't put a residential gas valve into a industrial and commercial systems. The pressures won't work. So 13.5.7 specifically addresses the technician becoming a mechanical engineer. I've talked about that before. You don't want to do that. Okay, flue connections. The venting system in an oil and gas burner appliance shall meet all applicable requirements of this standard and of NFPA 54. Again, we have a combination appliance. Not only do you have to meet NFPA 31 requirements, you have to meet NFPA 54, which is the National Fuel Gas Code. Okay? If there's a contradiction between the two codes, the more stringent requirements shall apply. In other words, you don't get to take the cheap way out. You have to do the strictest requirements if there's a contradiction between the two codes. Strictest requirements apply, which is usually the most expensive. For piping and fittings, okay, oil pipe meets all requirements of Chapter 8. That's our piping chapter. Piping for fuel gas comes back to NFPA 54. Okay? Again, testing, everything has to be tested for proper operation, combustion characteristics. In other words, you have to do combustion testing and everything else. Now, let me toss a question out here. If someone is licensed for a gas equipment, in other words, they do not carry an oil license. For example, if you have a D2 license in the state of Connecticut, you cannot do oil unless you have a second license as well. If you have a D2 license, you're not allowed to do oil. Can you work on a combination oil and gas appliance?
I don't think so.
That is an absolute no. Okay? This is what I keep coming back to when I try telling everybody about licensing. Take the extra time and get your S licenses in Connecticut. Okay? Because the S license lets you work on everything. Okay? Don't just get a D license. Okay? Oil is very heavy in Connecticut. Questions on Chapter 13, questions on code book, questions on state exams, anything anyone wants to know. Now's a chance to ask a question.
I'm good.
Okay, well, anybody who else is on the call who's just not tuned in or whatever, let me know if you have any questions on either the code or the state exams. I told you guys today is going to be a short day. There isn't much I can do with code. Tomorrow we're going to talk about outdoor reset control, so we'll spend a little bit more time. And Friday is your final exam. So that's all that I have for today. I'll post this recording later for the other 20 people that are not on the call. And that's it for today, guys. You have a good rest of the day.